are World War II and post-war economic reconstruction. 1. The war economy and the development of military industries. World War II, 1939–1945, profoundly altered the structure of the global economy. Unlike World War I, which was characterized by limited mobilization in some countries, WY demanded total war efforts. States redirected their entire economies toward the production of military goods, infrastructure, and services. The concept of a war economy became central to national survival and victory. Governments increased their control over production. Labor and capital and public expenditure surged. The state became the dominant economic actor. In the United States, the War Production Board coordinated the conversion of civilian industries into wartime production. Automobile factories produced tanks and aircraft. Consumer goods were limited, and rationing became widespread. By 1944, military expenditures accounted for over 40% of the U.S. gross national product (GNP), and unemployment, which had plagued the U.S. during the Great Depression, virtually disappeared. Germany, under the Nazi regime, implemented a tightly controlled war economy overseen by figures like Albert Speer. The use of forced labor and plundered resources from occupied territories sustained its military-industrial complex. Japan pursued a similar path, heavily centralizing control over strategic resources and increasing its imperial exploitation in East Asia. 2. The Bretton Woods system and the establishment of international monetary order. The collapse of international finance and trade during the interwar period, exacerbated by the Great Depression, competitive devaluations, and protectionism convinced post-war planners that a new international monetary order was necessary to avoid another economic catastrophe. In July 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design this system. The result was the Bretton Woods system, a landmark framework that would shape global economic relations for the next 3 decades. The key objectives of Bretton Woods were to ensure exchange rate stability, facilitate international trade, and promote economic growth. 2 major institutions emerged from the agreement. The International Monetary Fund (IMF), designed to oversee fixed exchange rates and provide temporary financial assistance to countries facing balance of payments problems. Its primary function was to maintain currency stability and prevent competitive devaluations. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development (IBRD), later part of the World Bank, created to provide long-term loans for post-war reconstruction and development, particularly in Europe and later in the Global South. While the Bretton Woods system fostered economic stability and growth in the 1950s and 1960s, it faced increasing pressure in the 1970s, eventually collapsing when President Nixon suspended dollar-gold convertibility in 1971. Nonetheless, it remains a key historical model of international monetary cooperation. 3. The Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Europe. In the aftermath of WW, much of Europe lay in physical and economic ruin. Infrastructure was destroyed, industrial capacity was shattered, and agricultural production was insufficient. Political instability, inflation, and hunger threatened the fragile peace. In this context, the Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program, ERP, was launched in 1947 by the United States under Secretary of State George C. Marshall. It provided over $13 billion, equivalent to more than $150 billion today, in economic aid to 16 Western European countries between 1948 and 1952. The goals were both economic and geopolitical: to rebuild war-torn economies, contain the spread of communism, and foster transatlantic solidarity. 4. The Cold War economic systems. Capitalism versus communism. The capitalist bloc U.S. and Western Europe. Capitalist economies were based on private property, free markets, and democratic institutions. The post-war capitalist world was characterized by mixed economies. States often intervened to regulate demand, ensure full employment, and expand welfare provisions. Keynesianism. Global trade and investment, encouraged through institutions like GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the IMF, and the World Bank, consumer capitalism, rising wages and productivity fueled mass consumption, especially in the United States and Western Europe. Capitalist economies grew rapidly during the post-war decades. The economic miracles of Germany, France, Italy, and Japan demonstrated how state-guided capitalism and international support could rebuild and transform former wartime economies. B. The Communist bloc, Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe. Communist economies operated under central planning, with the state owning the means of production. The Soviet model prioritized heavy industry, collectivized agriculture, and political control over economic decision-making. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, established in 1949, was the Soviet response to Western economic integration. It coordinated economic policy and trade among Eastern Bloc countries. However, the system struggled with inefficiencies, technological lag, and lack of innovation due to the absence of market signals. B. Economic globalization and the rise of neoliberalism in the late 20th century. 1. The oil shocks of the 1970s and global economic crises. The global economic landscape of the late 20th century was profoundly shaped by the oil shocks of the 1970s, which marked the end of the post-World War II economic boom. In 1973, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, imposed an oil embargo in response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled, leading to what became known as the First Oil Shock. This was followed by a second oil shock in 1979, triggered by the Iranian Revolution, which caused further volatility in oil supply and prices. 2. Neoliberal economic policies, Reaganomics, and Thatcherism. In response to the perceived failure of Keynesianism, a new economic paradigm emerged, neoliberalism, advocating free market solutions, deregulation, privatization, and a reduced role for the state in the economy. The intellectual foundations of neoliberalism can be traced to economists such as Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, who emphasized the inefficiencies of government intervention and the self-regulating power of markets. Two of the most influential political embodiments of neoliberalism were Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. Their policy approaches, Reaganomics and Thatcherism, respectively, sought to revive national economies by implementing four major strategies. 3. Financial globalization and the rise of multinational corporations. The 1980s and 1990s witnessed a dramatic acceleration of financial globalization, driven by advancements in technology, capital mobility, and policy liberalization. National boundaries became increasingly porous to the flow of goods, services, and especially capital. This financial revolution reshaped the global economy in several key ways. Deregulation of capital markets. Governments relaxed restrictions on foreign exchange controls, allowing money to move freely across borders. This gave rise to an explosion in global capital flows and international investment. 4. The information revolution and the emergence of the digital economy. Another transformative development of the late 20th century was the information revolution, driven by advances in computing, telecommunications, and the Internet. The digital revolution fundamentally altered how economies functioned and how globalization unfolded. Key aspects of the digital economy include automation and productivity gains. Technological advances increase productivity in manufacturing and services, often with fewer workers. Robotics, computer-aided design, and just-in-time inventory systems redefined production processes. Internet and communication technology, ICT. The Internet became a key infrastructure for global commerce, enabling real-time communication, data transfer, and digital transactions across continents. E-commerce platforms like Amazon and Alibaba, and social media networks, such as Facebook and Google, redefined consumer behavior and business models. Knowledge economy value creation shifted increasingly from material goods to intangible assets, data, intellectual property, software, and innovation. Human capital and education became central to economic competitiveness. Platform capitalism. Major tech companies emerged as dominant global actors, by controlling digital platforms. Their ability to extract and monetize user data became the new driver of economic value, raising concerns about data privacy, market monopolies, and digital labor precarity. This period also witnessed the rise of global finance, the spread of multinational corporations, and the beginnings of a truly interconnected digital economy. While these changes generated unprecedented wealth and integration, they also introduced instability, inequality, and environmental degradation.